Welcome to NarrativeNook audio tales where enchanted stories come to life. If you enjoy our stories, please subscribe, like and share to support our channel. Enjoy listening.
But after such a long time, no one was coming after him. Perhaps that woman was not someone powerful. Even the Mount Daytona Race Club, which definitely had a video of him wanting to hurt someone, remained quiet. It seemed that they had made a calculated decision and knew which side they could not offend. Solomon leaned back triumphantly and was itching to have fun again. So he had come to this club, which he frequently patronized. After all, she was such a beauty, he could not control his desire for her. He thought it would be nice to find out who she was. He sighed. Hearing the sigh of the man who was holding hers in his arms for the 100th time, an emotion flashed in her eyes. She coquettishly blinked at Solomon, and her fingers slowly drew circles on his chest. "What are you sighing about? Why don't you tell me?" she asked. Solomon glanced at her. This woman had found favor with him, and so he always looked for her whenever he came. He quickly grabbed her soft hand that she used to tease him on his chest. He held it in his hand and said sincerely, "How can I not be happy with you by my side?" She instantly knew that he did not want to talk about it. The woman was smart not to ask any more questions. She looked at Solomon with a smile and persuaded him to keep drinking. Hearing her soft, teasing voice, Solomon's heart almost melted. He had finished 2 bottles of whiskey, his face red, eyes unfocused, and his hands started to grope around blatantly. He looked at the woman in front of him, but she seemed to have changed into the beauty who smiled at him yesterday. Solomon was drooling for her. Staring at the beauty whom he had been dreaming all night, he lost control of himself, opening his mouth that smelled of alcohol as he could not wait to kiss her. His face, which looked somewhat prim usually, became extremely smutty. "Beauty, come here. Let me kiss you," he said. The woman looked at the delirious man and smiled even more broadly. She started to play hard to get, blocking his groping hand while muttering something seductive. "We have a new arrival. Do you want to try it?" the woman said. New arrival?" The drunk Solomon looked at the beauty in front of him and let out a couple of obscene laughs. "Then you and I okay?" The woman did not say yes or no, but meanly stretched out her hand to fan herself and whispered, "Why is it so hot here?" She then tore the thin clothes on her shoulders with no hesitation, exposing her smooth, fair skin. No way Solomon could resist this temptation. He pounced on her, but the woman was quick to react, bouncing a step back, just in time to avoid his grab. She then laughed softly. "Don't you want to try it?" Solomon's mind was completely controlled by alcohol and his desire. He looked at the sexily dressed beauty in front of him and swallowed hard. "Give it to me. Give it to me," he said. The woman slowly approached him, took a pink little bottle from between her fingers, and poured all the liquid into Solomon's wineglass. She swirled it and looked at the man in front of her with a beautiful smile. "Drink it." Solomon eagerly knocked back, not noticing that the smile on the woman's face had vanished. She looked icy, with a hint of hatred and relief flashing across her face. She then took his hand and walked him toward the door of the private lounge. Solomon now had fallen into a psychedelic trance. Solomon looked at the icy face in front of him, more certain that she was the beauty of yesterday. He had lost his sanity completely. He leaned staggeringly against the woman and felt as if something was wrong as he was led outside. But he soon indulged himself by leaning on her soft body with an intoxicated smile on his face. The woman led him to the door, opened the door of the private lounge, and as she continued to walk outside with Solomon, she seemed to trip and fell to the ground with Solomon on top of her. The woman cried out loud, trying desperately to push the man, who was heavy as an elephant, away, but to no avail. He weighed too much for her, and almost crushed her to the point of suffocation. The surveillance camera in the hallway perfectly recorded her struggles and cries, as well as Solomon's indecent behavior. She bellowed, "Help me," when she was suffocating. Just then, someone rushed out and grabbed the delirious Solomon. This night, Solomon was destined to become the laughingstock of everyone, and the Freeman family would fall in San Giotto. Meanwhile, Nicole was taking her grandmother to have a meal in the cafeteria. Mrs. Wallace Sr.'s most favored lad was Nicole, whom she raised from small. Her son and her daughter-in-law did not like her, and so did not agree for Nicole to take their family name. So she named Nicole and let Nicole adopt her family name, which allowed Nicole to go to school. She took care of Nicole, rain or shine, and this was her greatest expectation for her lad. Nicole grew up healthy with her, living a comfortable life according to her own wishes, not getting bullied until Nicole grew up to the point where she could close her eyes to meet her maker. Mrs. Wallace Sr. looked lovingly at Nicole and picked out all the meat from her plate and put it on Nicole's plate. "You disliked eating meat since you were small, but now is the best time to grow your body, so you must eat more." Nicole listened to the familiar nagging, but she did not look impatient, but just put half of the meat back on Mrs. Wallace Steve's plate. "You should eat more too." Mrs. Wallace Sr. looked at her slender body and felt sorry for her. When her granddaughter was in Great Oak, she always had activities in and was seldom at home, but once Nicole came home, she would prepare good food for her. And now that Nicole's living condition in San Joto had improved, yet she seemed to have become thinner. Thinking of the ridicule she had just gotten in the classroom, she could imagine what kind of life Nicole had spent here. Mrs. Wallace Sr. felt terrible, but the thought of the kids who had just stepped up for her made her feel a little better. Nicole was adaptable and surely had some friends. She knew what Mrs. Wallace Sr. was thinking when she saw her expression. Nicole slowly and methodically bit the chicken on the plate and whispered, "Grandma, I still have a lot of friends. You don't have to worry too much about me." Not only friends but also brothers, who were very protective of her. Mrs. Wallace Sr. thought her granddaughter was just a little introverted, but had no problem making friends. She guessed she was too much of an alarmist. Nicole was the child of the Riddle family, and even if they were unfriendly to Nicole, they would still have to give face to the Riddle family. With this in mind, Mrs. Wallace Sr. breathed a sigh of relief. She came just to see Nicole, not expecting that she would be an added burden for Nicole. As she was thinking about it, Nicole held her hand that she was clenching subconsciously. Nicole looked at Mrs. Wallace Sr. with tenderness and a little helplessness in her eyes. Her grandmother was thoughtful and caring, but because she was used to living a hard life, she was particularly sentimental. "You will always be my grandma. If you feel like seeing me, come visit me, and don't think too much." Mrs. Wallace Sr. was stupefied. Looking her granddaughter into her sincere and beautiful eyes, she appeared surprised, but soon was overwhelmed by emotion. She held out her frail hand, turned her face away to wipe the tears from the corners of her eyes before turning back and smiling at Nicole. I know. The fact that Nicole was a member of the Riddle family had always been a mental obstacle to her. After all, the Riddle family was a world of difference from her family. She wondered if Nicole would also dislike her and refuse to acknowledge someone embarrassing like her as her grandmother. But Nicole's attitude had reassured her she should know Nicole's better than anyone, as she was the person who raised her. She knew Nicole was not someone who was ungrateful. Mrs. Wallace Sr. patted Nicole's hand with tears in her eyes, but her voice was much calmer. "Nicole, will you take me on a tour of your school?" She really wanted to know more about Nicole's living environment, and to know that Nicole was doing well so that she could feel at ease. Nicole saw that Mrs. Wallace Sr. emotion was recovering, so she nodded. Looking at the plate in front of her, she said, "Then finish your meal, and then I will take you to tour the campus." Mrs. Wallace South Carolina smiled and nodded, knowing that her granddaughter always granted her every wish. Snow, who was sitting not far away, watched on with mockery in her eyes. No matter how much Grandpa treasures Nicole, she's still a country bumpkin. She even brought a frumpy old lady to dine here. It's so embarrassing. When the thought of what her grandfather had said to her and her sister the other day, Snow could not hide the mockery on her face. Ivana, who was beside her, quickly sensed something was wrong with Snow's emotions, as Snow was clasping the fork so hard that her nails began to crack, yet she was unaware of it. "Snow, are you okay?" Ivana asked in a whisper. Evand was accompanying Snow to wait for Harvey in the cafeteria, but Harvey never showed. Instead, they saw Nicole bring an old lady to dine here. Snow's lips curled up with disdain. The heat had died down on the campus forum, and everyone was just taking a wait-and-see attitude, not knowing what was going on. Some Snow's fans, who had also seen the confrontation between the two the other day, said that they could not accept a lunatic like Snow. Even if Snow was trying hard to save his image now, nothing would help. Ivana's focus was not on Snow at all. When she saw Snow shake her head, she knew Snow was fine. She then mysteriously leaned closer to Snow's face and asked softly, "Your pink diamond hasn't been found yet. Have you found out who stole it?" Ivana was convinced that Snow did have a diamond like that, as she knew very well that every time Harvey went on a trip, he would bring back something, such as bracelets and necklaces, for Snow. Each one of them made her envious of Snow. So it was possible that Harvey had given Snow a 10-carat diamond this time. Snow had always treasured the gifts that Harvey gave hers. So the disappearance of the diamond was no accident. Someone must have stolen it. When Snow heard Ivana ask about this, it stirred her emotions again. Snow clenched the fork in her hands in anger, as if she could not feel the sharp pain from her nails. She had already gone back to the old mansion looking for it, but she had still not found a clue. She thought about it and was sure that it must be Nicole who stole her pink diamond. No one except for Nicole in the family would be jealous of her. Otherwise, Nicole would not have stayed just for a little while and left. She must have felt guilty. With this in mind, Snow looked at Nicole with resentment. She did not know where Nicole got the purple diamond from, but she was sure that it was definitely not the Riddle family who gave it to her. She cherished that pink diamond because it was a keepsake of love from Harvey. So she wanted to find a way to get it back. At last, Snow could not hold herself back. She walked over to Nicole, gritting her teeth as she looked at Nicole with vicious eyes. "Thief! I swear I will expose you." She then turned to look up and down at Mrs. Wallace Sr. with contempt on her face. "Wallace Sr. So you're Nicole's grandmother? There is no wonder. Birds of a feather flock together. You'd better keep an eye on your granddaughter." There was an imperceptible sense of disgust in her voice. With that, Snow turned and wanted to leave. But the sight of two people walking toward her stopped her in her tracks. One of those two was none other than Harvey, whom she had been waiting for a long time. He casually greeted the other classmates around him as he kept walking toward Nicole. Mrs. Wallace Sr. heard what Snow had said and looked at Nicole with confusion, wanting to ask what was going on. In her eyes, Nicole was not a kid who would steal. Seeing that Snow was coming over again, Nicole's face turned frosty. She smiled gently at Mrs. Wallace Sr. and then said coldly, "Don't worry about her. She feels uncomfortable without looking for trouble every day." Surprisingly, those people around her who had heard it actually felt that there was some truth in what Nicole said. Snow had searched Nicole and said what she wanted to say, but she never gave an apology. Not only that, she kept coming looking for trouble, and that had started to cause resentment. Snow did not know what everyone was thinking. She just quickly sorted out her dress and then stood quietly with a gentle smile on her face. Watching Harvey approach, she wanted to talk to him, but Harvey skimmed straight past her, not even giving her a smile. Edwin, who followed Harvey and at first disliked Snow because of her hypocrisy, saw Harvey's attitude and inexplicably sympathized with Snow. But his sympathy for Snow just lasted for a second. He also ignored Snow and walked past her. Snow's expression crashed in an instant. She turned to look at Harvey from behind, as if she had seen Ivana's mocking gaze not far away. "It was all Nicole's fault," she said in her mind. Harvey and Edwin stopped in front of Nicole. Harvey smiled at her, then turned to Mrs. Wallace Sr. "Hello, Mrs. Wallace," he said gently. As two fine young men came over to say hello, Mrs. Wallace Sr. looked at Nicole in puzzlement, as if waiting for her to introduce them, only to see Nicole's brows knitted together. "What are you doing here?" Nicole asked. Harvey did not mind her attitude. Instead, he sat down next to her. Edwin asked for Mrs. Wallace Sr.'s permission before he, too, sat down by her side. "I heard your grandma was coming, so I thought I should come to meet her," Harvey said, sounding as if he was someone close to Nicole or something. Now, even Mrs. Wallace Sr. felt a little unease, but she was worried that he was Nicole's good friend, so she asked tentatively, "You are?" Harvey smiled with no hesitation. "Nicole and my grandfather know each other, and it was he who recommended Nicole to study in this school. Knowing that you came to see Nicole, I thought I have to come to meet you too." Harvey was not lying. When he got the news of Nicole's grandmother coming, he immediately came over. Nicole could not stand him. She stood up abruptly and glared at him. "What do you want?" Harvey felt insulted by her question. He was exasperated that she thought he was here to see her grandma with some ulterior motive. Harvey's face sank, but his eyes were still gentle, just that there was an added unfathomableness in them. Even if he had a motive, it was definitely his hope that by pleasing her grandmother, Nicole would not be so resentful of him. Thinking of this, Harvey looked up at Nicole thoughtfully. "I heard you and your grandma used to live in Great Oak, he asked. If Sean's information was accurate, he might get the answer he wanted from Nicole. But Nicole ignored the strange questions. She stood up with Mrs. Wallace Sr., wanting to leave. But Mrs. Wallace Sr. looked at Harvey and said all of a sudden, "Young man, what do you want to know?" This person did not look like an ordinary kid. There seemed to be something terrible surging and struggling in his eyes. Harvey looked at Mrs. Wallace Sr. in puzzlement. What do I want to know? He did not know, either. Thinking of this, he smiled softly. I just want to say that maybe we should at least be friends. What do you say, Nicole? Nicole was not in the mood to listen to his nonsense. She picked up her food tray, and just as she reached for her grandma's, Edwin, who sat next to Mrs. Wallace Sr., had picked up the tray without looking the slightest disgusted. Let's go. I will help Grandma do it, he said to Nicole in a matter-of-course tone of voice. Harvey watched on and narrowed his eyes. He wondered what Edwin was up to. Mrs. Wallace Sr. looked at Edwin and thought that he looked cute, at least not as crafty as the young man just now. As the three of them left together, Harvey's face turned to become a little frightening. But it was only for a moment before he quickly regained his demeanor and put a nonchalant smile back on his face. Snow looked at him from a distance away. Seeing that he was alone now and thinking that she finally had a chance, she came up to him. Harvey, she greeted him. Harvey glanced at her without emotion and then let out a half-smile. What's up? Snow saw that Harvey had talked to her and became bolder. She walked over to Harvey cautiously and said, "What is there to talk about with the old lady from the countryside?" Before she could finish speaking, Harvey shot her an icy look and then let out a cruel smile at the self-righteous girl in front of him. We're going to have a lot of common topics, he said. But he would have nothing to say to Snow. Thinking of that fast the other day, Harvey looked at Snow with pity. The fact that she could even lose the gift that suited her best made him less likely want to talk to her. Snow. Harvey's voice was indifferent, but with a hint of extreme malice to it. Come back and talk to me when you get that diamond back. He then got up and left, leaving Snow to watch him leave with her eyes wide open. Snow was rooted to the spot for a long while before a hint of ruthlessness surfacing in her eyes. She knew it, Harvey would only be angry with her because she had lost the diamond. I'm going to get the diamond back whatever it takes, she said in her mind. Edwin accompanied Nicole and Mrs. Wallace Sr. on a campus tour. Nicole had not been to many areas of the campus. She spent her time at the sports ground, classroom, cafeteria, dormitory, and of course the cafe every day. She had never been to other entertainment facilities. Edwin was a junior in college, and so he knew the campus much better than Nicole did. Mrs. Wallace Sr. was following Edwin from behind and looked at him with interest. Even the look in Nicole's eyes had also become gentle. Just then, Edwin's mobile phone rang. He picked the phone and answered it, his face grave. Nicole saw his expression and knew that it must be about something unusual. Sure enough, after hanging up the phone, Edwin apologetically told Nicole and Mrs. Wallace Sr. that he had to leave to take care of something. Mrs. Wallace Sr. waved her hand, saying that he had no obligation to show her around, and that she was happy to hear such an interesting explanation from him. Nicole also nodded appreciatively at Edwin. She then looked on and narrowed her eyes as Edwin went in a hurry. The thought of Edwin's request for her to grant him a favor came to mind. Had she not been tracked, she would have wanted to help him. As she thought of Zeke, she recalled what Zeke told her this morning. He had accepted a job that seemed not easy, and that he would contact her at any time. Nicole looked at the empty mailbox and then thought of Edwin's expression just now. As if thinking of something, a light flashed in her eyes. Mrs. Wallace Sr. did not notice all this. She felt a little tired after walking for so long, so Nicole took her to the school gate. Mrs. Wallace Sr. asked casually, "Who's that guy? He seems like a good guy." Nicole did not give it a second thought but said casually, "He is my senior." Mrs. Wallace Sr. looked at her granddaughter thoughtfully and said in a soft voice, "The boy in the cafeteria earlier. You have to stay away from him." She didn't say this last part. Nicole saw the hesitation in Mrs. Wallace Sr. "He and I will not have a chance." Hearing this, Mrs. Wallace Sr. nodded in relief. The cicadas were still restless, and the afternoon sun was brutal in the early fall. Nicole was young and strong, so she did not feel anything. But she was worried that her grandmother could not stand the heat. So she and her grandmother walked in the shades of the trees all the way, and she gently fanned her grandmother with her hand. Nicole was preoccupied with Mrs. Wallace Sr. all the way and had not noticed the familiar black vehicle with the unknown logo trailing her. The car drove slowly and followed the two of them, not honking so as not to disturb them. It was Mrs. Wallace Sr. who first discovered the vehicle. She looked back at it with some trepidation before she said to Nicole, "Do you see that there's a car trailing us?" Nicole looked back cautiously. Immediately, a look of pleasant surprise filled her face when she saw the car. Mrs. Wallace Sr. knew her granddaughter well and looked at her thoughtfully. She had never seen Nicole having such an expression before. The vehicle pulled up in front of them, and the window dropped, revealing Jared's face inside. He nodded gently at Mrs. Wallace Sr. and then looked at Nicole. "Do you want to get in the car?" Nicole looked at him with a smile on her face subconsciously. Seeing her nod, Jared stepped out of the car and opened the rear passenger door for Mrs. Wallace Sr. After she got in, he went around to the other side and revealed a graceful smile when he saw Nicole's expression easing up. "May I, Nicole?" he said with a gesture. Nicole did not decline. She looked at Jared with a half-smile before getting in the car. If anyone saw this, they would open their mouths in shock. People would wonder what it took for someone to make Jared Johnston of San Joto their chauffeur, and in this case, an old lady and a little girl. Even the president of Hustuaberg would probably not get this privileged treatment. But Jared was not ashamed of it at all. Instead, he had a smile on his face, as if doing these things made him feel happy. He finally got into the front passenger seat and looked at Nicole in the rearview mirror. "Going back to the Riddle mansion?" Nicole nodded, and Jared started the car. In order to take care of the elderly, he drove slowly with soft music playing in the background. The seat felt cool and comfortable even in the scorching sun, with a faint scent of fragrance. Jared, who was sitting in the front, said to Mrs. Wallace Sr., "Hello, I'm a friend of Nicole's, Jared." "Hello." Mrs. Wallace Sr. immediately broke into a smile, as she had a good impression of Jared. She then looked at Nicole with a knowing look in her eyes. Nicole felt embarrassed. She knew she could not tell her grandma that Jared was her fiancé. "He is the owner of a cafe opposite our campus." "I didn't know that." If he could open a cafe in a place like San Joto, he must be pretty okay, Mrs. Wallace Sr. thought. It would be even better if he was not someone with too high of a social status and did not find Nicole embarrassing him. Now, Mrs. Wallace Sr. felt a lot more at ease. "This must be your first time in San Joto. I will show you around," Jared said. "It's so nice of you, but I don't want you to trouble you." Mrs. Wallace Sr. was hesitant because she did not want to trouble anyone. "Not at all." Jared smiled and motioned for Max to drive the car out of school. Along the way, Jared occasionally struck up a conversation to make Mrs. Wallace Sr. feel at ease. Seeing that Grandma and Jared were chatting happily, Nicole looked out the window. The dazzling sunlight was perfectly blocked by the window of the car, but she could still feel the warm and pleasant afternoon feeling. A gentle smile crept across her face. During the chat, Jared and Mrs. Wallace Sr. had talked about Nicole's childhood. Mrs. Wallace Sr. looked into the distance when she recalled the past. "Nicole didn't laugh much since she was a kid, but I never have to worry about her." Mrs. Wallace Sr. had a faint sense of nostalgia in her eyes as she recollected the memories. Jared looked at the two of them in the rearview mirror and saw a rare, strong emotion on Nicole's beautiful face, but he said nothing, just leaving space for them. For the first time, he saw Nicole looked so soft, without the slightest caution or mental guard. Her grandmother must be important to her. After driving around San Joto for a round, the car dropped them off at the Riddle mansion. Because Mr. Riddle Sr. was sick, and Daniel and his wife almost stayed in the mansion most of the time, so Nicole brought his grandmother here. As the car came to a halt, Mrs. Wallace Sr. and Nicole got out of the car. Nicole looked at Jared. Jared smiled at Nicole and then said, "Mrs. Wallace, Nicole, I'll see you around." See Mrs. Wallace Sr. nodding, Jared then rolled up the window. The black vehicle drove off like an off-string arrow, speeding away on the road. Mrs. Wallace Sr. looked in the direction where Jared had left and muttered to herself, "This kid is really good-looking." In Mrs. Wallace Sr.'s eyes, none of the people she had ever seen today could measure up to Jared. That was probably why Nicole liked him. Nicole had a sharp ear and had heard what Mrs. Wallace Sr. muttered. For a moment, she did not know whether to cry or laugh. Mrs. Wallace Sr. ignored her expression. As Nicole helped her go inside, she casually asked Nicole without looking at her, "What is your relationship with the young man who sent us back?" Nicole looked at Mrs. Wallace Sr., who narrowed her eyes, and said with a straight face, "Friends." "Friend? The boy who eagerly took us touring the campus is just a senior of hers. While this guy is a friend, he probably has a special position in Nicole's heart." Mrs. Wallace Sr. was delighted, and already had a plan in mind. Nicole was her precious granddaughter, and if she had to pick one guy among Nicole's suitors, Mrs. Wallace Sr. would not hesitate to choose Jared. Mrs. Wallace Sr. knew nothing about cars or fragrance, but just judging by the way Jared spoke, and his attitude toward Nicole, she knew he was a trustworthy one. With this in mind, she nodded with satisfaction. She did not expect to get such a surprise on this trip. Looking at the door of the Riddle mansion, Mrs. Wallace Sr. suddenly felt a sense of relief. Meanwhile, as Jared was on his way back from the Riddle mansion, he received a call from Max. Everything went smoothly. Max looked at Solomon, who was tied in front of him. Solomon had obviously not yet awakened from the effects of the drug, and from time to time, he made a pig-like hum. Jared heard the voice over there and frowned in disgust, then whispered to Max, "Follow the protocol and deal with it, but don't get your hands dirty." Max said yes, and then with a gentle wave of his hand, two men came up from behind him, carried Solomon like garbage, and threw him into the cold detention room. He then turned his head and looked at the person behind him, his frosty face looking inexplicably intimidating. He behaved indecently in public, abused psychedelic drugs, and even assaulted a bar girl. "Inspector Pierce, how would you handle this case?" Inspector Pierce quickly wiped the sweat from his forehead. He looked at the imposing young man and knew that the young man was someone whom he could not afford to mess with. Looking at Solomon, who was constantly writhing like a bug in the detention room, Inspector Pierce's face appeared grave. "How dare this Solomon do whatever he pleases in his territory," he said in his mind. He would not have cared had Solomon kept things in the private lounge, but he took the woman outside and the surveillance had captured his act of pursuing excitement and even assault in its entirety. Misuse of psychedelics was a serious offense in San Joto. No way Solomon was not aware of it. Thinking of this, Inspector Pierce's face sank. Instead of beating around the bush, he spoke directly to Max. "Investigation is being carried out in full swing, and we will certainly give you all an answer. Solomon's blood test is already underway, and we will soon know what he has done to himself. Another thing, we want to find how you found what happened and made the report." Max nodded. He passed a glance over, and a woman came out. There were bruises on her face and body. It looked like she had been badly abused, with her beautiful face completely unrecognizable now. Inspector Pierce had handled many cases, but he still could not help but gasp in shock at seeing the woman's condition. "Solomon is really a scumbag," he said in his mind. Max saw the surprised expression on Inspector Pierce's face and said, "We were in the private lounge next door when we heard a woman calling for help. So we opened the door to see what was going on, and the rest was history." Inspector Pierce nodded in acknowledgement. Although not in the way he had imagined, their affidavit was noticeably more accidental and truer, and his apprehension about this case lessened. He now found Solomon really disgusting. A medic hurried over and nodded to Inspector Pierce with a serious face. No wonder Solomon got so high for so long. He had taken none other than the most common aphrodisiac sold in the black market. Commonly known as filter, it was added to whiskey to increase its efficacy and could make people delirious. Inspector Pierce's eyes turned cold as he looked at Solomon in the detention room. "Wake him up." The detestation in his voice was apparent. Max walked out of the cold detention center, followed by several people and a docile-looking woman. As the intense sunlight beat down on his body, he looked back at her in appreciation. "You're doing a good job." The woman smiled and had a kind of abused beauty in her, with those bruises on her face. Max did not miss a hint of exhaustion hidden in her eyes. He waved his hand, and soon someone behind him handed a few thin pieces of paper into the woman's hand. She took it, and soon her eyes widened. It turned out to be her termination letter with the clubhouse. She was just an ordinary waitress in that clubhouse at first, But later, because of her good looks, she was tricked into the trade by the manager and signed a contract with astronomical liquidated damages for breach of contract. If she worked for less than 10 years, she could never pay off that money. At first, she had agreed to the deal because she hated Solomon, not expecting that they would do her such a big favor. The woman raised her head, her young face written with vicissitudes of life. She looked at Max with a complicated look in her eyes. "Thank you," she said in a soft voice. Max waved his hand, signaled that she did not have to thank him. "You know what to say when you give your statement to the police, don't you?" He still looked expressionless. Of course, the woman knew what he meant. Max had done her such a huge favor, and Solomon was a scum. Thinking of this, she nodded her head with no hesitation. These people were the one who pulled her out of the mire. Max said no more. He turned and left with his men. When they met last night, he had already made it clear to this woman. Jared had never made any mistakes with the person he chose to deal with. Thinking of this, Max had a faint look of admiration in his eyes. His boss had almost predicted what was going to happen. Solomon would go to the clubhouse today, look for this woman, and get drunk, so he instructed them to negotiate with this girl in advance, teaching her step by step how to lure the scum into the trap, and then he would be done for. Moreover, it was Inspector Pierce who was chosen. He was well known for his effort in rescuing women in trouble. It was said that Inspector Pierce had once rescued abducted women in Wyoming State. During the operation, many of his teammates were injured, and the women trafficker killed his only daughter in retaliation. It was not hard to imagine what would be the fate if Solomon fell into his hands. Max still remembered his boss's grim face, which looked so cold and unfathomable. He casually made a telephone call and smiled when he heard the guy at the other end whine. "I saw people I shouldn't have seen in Club Studio." Claus was complaining that he did not take him on a mission. And when he heard that, he couldn't care less about anything but said a few words to Claus. "I'll go over," Claus said. He jumped into his sports car and sped toward the clubhouse where Solomon was. When he arrived, he walked to the reception counter and took out a card expressionlessly. "I want to know all the customer information here in 2 hours." The reception guy looked at the card in his hand and nodded respectfully, then turned on the computer with trembling hands. The hands of those who were working in this line would never shiver unless they really could not help it. Claus looked at the reception guy and was pleased. He enjoyed the pleasure of having someone serving him. After he casually looked around for a while, the reception guy walked over with a tablet. "Mr. Graham, the customer details are in here. Take your time and call me if you need anything again." There was a hint of fear in his voice. Claus took the tablet, ignoring the reception guy, and slowly and leisurely browsed through the list. He cocked an eyebrow when he saw those familiar names, but things had nothing to do with him, so he did not want to be nosy. He kept scrolling down the list with his callous finger and finally stopped at 14:20 p.m. Michael's name appeared a few minutes before Solomon's record. Claus raised his eyebrows with interest. He returned the tablet to the reception guy and thanked him politely. The reception guy shivered and then forced a smile that looked uglier than crying. "It's my job," he said. Claus ignored him, returned to his car, and replied to Max's message.
Thank you for listening. If you have enjoyed this story, please like and share so others can see it too. Also hit the subscription button and notification bell so you can be notified on our next release. Thank you for your support. God bless you.